where do things stand with Iran? Okay, where do things stand with the memorandum of understanding, the deal that Trump is trying to make or is about to make, and the Straits of Hormuz and all of that? That's what we're going to get into in this video. Please make sure that you're subscribed to this channel. Please make sure that you tell other people what we're doing on this channel, and make sure that you're subscribed to Israel 365 News and that you're checking out all the content that we're putting up there on a daily basis, important interviews and other video content there, so that way you're getting everything that we're putting out. And also please be sure to check out the Shoulder to Shoulder podcast playlist on this channel. Now, we're going to do this by watching a clip of General Jack Keane on Fox News. And I'm going to pause the clip at a couple points and elaborate on what General Keane is saying. So let's hit it.
Let's bring in retired four-star general, Fox News senior strategic analyst and chairman of the Institute of Study of War, General Jack Keane. General, the president hasn't signed off on these deal points, which is an extension of the ceasefire. But what do you think about it?
Yeah, well, let's first of all, I think when you look at it, we've got to remind ourselves, who are the Iranians here? And certainly the administration is very clear-eyed in who they are. In fact, I spoke to one of the negotiators earlier this week for a lengthy conversation, and there's no doubt in my mind that he's very clear-eyed in what we're dealing with here. What did we see after the 12-day war last June? The thing that got our attention and alarmed us is how they recommitted to all of their original goals. Recover the nuclear program, ballistic missile acceleration, continued support for the proxies. All of that was going on, and the degree that it was going on, particularly with ballistic missiles, precipitated and was the basic reason for why we have this combined operation against the Iranians this year, beginning back in February. And we've got further evidence. So my point is, it's unlikely they're going to change. No matter what deal we put together, at the end of it, they're going to want to recover everything that they're losing and go back to their original goals. So in the deal, and our negotiators understand this, we've got to have the provisions in there to prevent as much of that as possible from happening.
Okay, let's unpack that. So he starts off by saying that, what alarmed us, we have to know who we're dealing with, because what alarmed us and kind of surprised us after the 12-day war was how they recommitted themselves to all of their original goals, to ramping up ballistic missile production, to funding the proxies, to the nuclear program. They were doing that, and especially, and he even mentioned with the ballistic missile programs, they were accelerating it, and it took us by surprise. Okay, that's the fact that it took them by surprise really speaks to the fact that the Americans, no matter how much they see it, they don't see it. They don't understand who they're dealing with. But let's talk about that commitment of the Iranians to all of their goals after the 12-day war, because it's so relevant to the moment that we're in now. When the 12-day war ended, President Trump announced, and I remember I was upset about it at the time, he said that he was going to lift some sanctions. He was going to allow Iran to sell their oil because they just suffered so much damage to their country, and so much of their leadership was knocked out, and all the damage that was done, that he wanted them to be able to rebuild their country. That was the wording he used at the time. Now, what did they do with all the money that they made from that? Did they rebuild their country? No, absolutely not. They used it for all of this. But I want to put this into even a more specific context, which is the context of the Iranian economy. You see, if Iran was a wealthy country, that the economy was doing well, and all of this other activity, the ballistic missiles, the nuclear program, the proxies, was all kind of what they do with their disposable income. So it would be one thing if they then, after the 12-day war, ramped it all up and recommitted themselves to those goals. But let's understand, the Iranian economy has been an absolute free fall and crisis for over a year. It's been collapsing, so much so that for a long time now, since before this war, the Iranian people have had a water crisis. People open their tap and no water comes out. This was going on over the last year. They've had rolling blackouts because they don't have enough energy. They don't have enough electricity. Never mind that they're one of the largest oil-producing nations in the world. They could have electricity all they want. But the infrastructure there is so terrible, and the currency was in free fall. Think about this. The protests that almost brought down the regime in December and January, that led to the chain of events that brings us to where we are now, those big protests, they were because of the economy. One important difference between those protests and earlier protests that we've seen in Iran, earlier mass protests that we've seen over the last few years in Iran, is that those other earlier protests that we saw had to do with people wanting their freedom from the Islamic oppression. They were led by the enlightened. They were led by university students. They were led by women's groups who were looking for their freedom. This was different. The driving force behind these protests were the merchants, the shop owners in the bazaar in Tehran, who traditionally were much more pro-regime and didn't participate in those other protest movements. And they were the ones driving these protests because of the economy, the currency collapsing, the hyperinflation, the lack of water, the lack of electricity. This is what these protests were about. Now, think about that now. Pull back the camera. After the 12-day war, their economy is in free fall. The people are restless. The protests at the end of that get to the point where they almost bring down the regime. And in that context, they still spent every dollar they had to not only go back to nuclear program, ballistic missiles, funding proxies, but to ramp it up. That's who we're dealing with here. They were even willing to risk their own regime for the sake of ramping up the ballistic missile program. Now, about that ballistic missile program, I'm so happy Jack Keane brought it up, because this is one of these arguments that we have to have on top of our mind for all of those ridiculous conversations that we all have with people who think that this war was a terrible idea. You see, whenever people argue against this war, the first thing they go to is the nuclear threat. And they say there was no imminent threat of nuclear weapons. And that is a straw man argument. It is a red herring. Why? Because Secretary of State Rubio said this very clearly. Pete Hegseth said this very clearly. And Jack Keane implied it here by talking about the increase in their ballistic missile program, which is what precipitated this military action. This was never about an imminent threat of nuclear weapons. It was about the fact that their ballistic missile production in Iran before the 12-day war was 30 to 50 ballistic missiles per month. And after the 12-day war, they ramped it up, and it was upwards of 100 ballistic missiles per month, and it was accelerating. They were going to ramp it up to 300 to 500 ballistic missiles per month. And they were amassing such a large stockpile of long-range ballistic missiles, long and short-range ballistic missiles, that the danger was that they would soon achieve enough of a ballistic missile capability to provide a canopy, a cover, an umbrella, a shield that would protect their nuclear program so that they could then operate their nuclear program with impunity, because they would have a defensive shield of ballistic missiles that would make it too costly to do anything about the nuclear program. So it's not about the imminent threat of nuclear. It's about the ballistic missiles that they were ramping up. So that's a good point by General Keane about the ballistic missiles. But the key takeaway of this first segment of his comments is we have to remember who we are dealing with. There's no moderating them. They're not going to lick their wounds and start getting interested in making civil life and domestic life better for their people and drop their goals. Okay, these are 12er Shiite Mahdists who want to bring the apocalypse. Again, they almost risked their regime for this between the 12-day war and this war. We have to remember who we're dealing with. That's Jack Keane's point. Okay, next point.
Second thing is, we know they're going to cheat. Look at this. Right now, what's taking place just this week alone with the violation of the ceasefire in the Straits of Hormuz. Who's doing that? The Iranians are doing that. And we had to react to it. Look what they've done in Lebanon. The ceasefire began on April the 8th. And since April the 8th, less than 2 months, they have fired rockets and missiles into northern Israel over 900 times. 1,200 plus drones have been fired into northern Israel, all since April the 8th. And that is under the guise of a ceasefire. And the Israelis are in a defensive crouch because they're abiding by the terms of the deal, which is they can only conduct defensive operations. I point this out because it reminds us who we really are dealing with here. They are likely to want to cheat. Now,
Okay, the Lebanon issue. So he pointed out there are 1,200 drones, 900 missiles and rockets that have been fired at Israeli northern communities since April 8th. Oh, isn't there a ceasefire? Look, Israeli northern communities are getting hammered by Hezbollah, and the Israelis, as he said, are in this defensive crouch because they're abiding by what Trump wants here, more or less. This is a very key point here. It's one of the main reasons I made this video, that a point that I want to share with you. There's a couple of key issues I want to bring up. There's a belief by President Trump, by the Trump administration, that if Israel de-escalates in Lebanon, if Israel keeps things on a lower boil in Lebanon, that will help the negotiations in Tehran. And I believe that it's actually just the opposite. It's just the opposite. I believe that if the Israelis escalate in Lebanon and they're pounding Hezbollah, and Hezbollah is even, let's say Israel were to push Hezbollah to the brink of complete collapse, and Israel's destroying Hezbollah, and Hezbollah is losing its grip on the country of Lebanon, that panic and that pressure will actually have a similar effect as the blockade. Why does the blockade work? Why is it at all effective? Because of the losses of hundreds of millions of dollars that it causes the Iranian regime every day. The logic behind them is the same. The Iranians' logic has always been extend things, right? Play for more time. They believe that the longer they can drag out negotiations and make a negotiation to negotiate, and we're thinking about it, and let's talk, and keep the negotiations going, keep kicking the can down the road, they get closer to election season, to the midterms. But also they just generally believe, it's not just about the midterms, this has always been their negotiating tactic, that playing for more time works for them because of the way Westerners negotiate. That the longer you drag out a negotiation with Westerners, the more likely it is that in order to get a breakthrough, the Westerners will come up with some new concession or some new confidence building measure that they can do. They'll come up with something that they'll soften their position as time goes on. That's what they see in the Western negotiating approach. So for a variety of reasons, the Iranians, their strategy is to always play for more time. The reason that the blockade is so effective, it's negotiating under fire, is that you keep the pressure on them in such a way that time is no longer on their side. And that pushes back on their strategy. The same is true if Israel was escalating against Hezbollah in Lebanon. It takes away the advantage of time, because with every passing day, this asset of theirs, Hezbollah, which is not just about Hezbollah, the militia, the asset, it's also about the control that Hezbollah has, the grip that Hezbollah has, and thereby Iran has on the Lebanese government. So the more Hezbollah gets weakened and gets degraded in an aggressive way by the Israelis, the more it ramps up pressure on the Iranians, and it gives more leverage to Donald Trump. Israel and Lebanon could be the stick while he's playing a carrot. I think that he's making a strategic mistake, believing that Israel keeping things quiet in Lebanon is good for the negotiations when it's actually not. And there's the larger issue of Israel's behavior in Lebanon. Listen, Israel needs to defend its northern communities. Our northern communities are getting pummeled, and the Israelis are not going to sit idly by and let this happen, which brings us to a key issue. I mentioned this in one other video, but we really need to talk about it. And I don't see anyone else discussing this, which is the effects of the elections, the upcoming elections, because there's, of course, the midterm election in the United States, but there's also an Israeli national election coming this fall, probably around the same time as the US midterms. While we don't have an exact date for it yet, it's probably coming in October. What does this mean? We're going to see the following dynamic. As we get closer to the midterms, the prevailing wisdom is that because of the unpopularity in the United States of kinetic action, of going back to real war, that the closer we get to the more the midterms approach, the more President Trump has a disincentive for going to war, the more the more President Trump will want to avoid kinetic activity, the closer the midterms get. But in Israel, it's actually the opposite. Because in Israel, there's a lot of anxiety over what is perceived as unfinished business, that we don't have victory over Hamas in Gaza. We don't have victory over Hezbollah in Lebanon. We don't have victory yet over the Iranian regime. They're still there. And there's a real sense, and meanwhile, our northern towns are getting shelled by drones and missiles every day. And in Israel, the sitting on our hands and holding back is actually very unpopular. And Prime Minister Netanyahu's incentive as elections approach is actually to escalate kinetic activity. What does this mean? This means that President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu's interests, as affected by the upcoming elections, actually diverge. That for President Trump, as the elections approach, there's an incentive to de-escalate kinetically or to not return to kinetic action. And with Prime Minister Netanyahu, the incentives move in the other direction. This is something to watch for in the days and weeks ahead.
We've got good leverage points here. Number one, the blockade ourselves. That'll get us the Straits of Hormuz open. And I'm assuming the president is looking at the text and seeing what's in there. And I'll get back to that in a second. And the other leverage point is the money. We have the money. We have their frozen assets and we have sanctions. So we can meter that out based on how their behavior is changing and what their level of commitment is. And then the thing that you mentioned, and the president mentioned also last night in the interview, we can go back to military operations. Where the Iranians are, they want to stretch these negotiations out as long as possible because then they think in their minds it's less likely the president will go back into military operations. But they have miscalculated about this president before, and that's dangerous on this part, and they would likely do that again here. When it gets to the straits that you're talking about here, Brian, I think there's some issues that are likely we want to see in the text, and that may be what's the land. And I don't know. We can. I don't want to speculate about the text, but I think what we know the issues are. Iran has to demine, and that probably is going to take a few weeks to do that. Why? Because they don't know where all the mines are that they put down. So that has to happen. But the southern lane is open. Because we opened it, and traffic will begin to flow right through there. So there'll be some relief immediately, but it'll take some time before it's all relieved. Number two, and you mentioned it, there can be no fees. There are not going to be any tolls, fees, or whatever you want to describe it. None whatsoever. And the third thing, I think the administration is certainly very much aware of this. We cannot leave Iran with the implication that they're in control of it. And what do I mean by that? Well, because they're organizing when and who is going to move through the straits. That's control. That's got to be off the books. They have their hands off of it. This is international waters, freedom of navigation. They don't have a say in any of it. Then there's the nuclear enrichment. We want all of it out of there, regardless of the percentage. That's a fact. And that's got to happen. And that's the president's main objective, for sure. And that's the reality of it. And certainly there are other things that are going to take place here. And the money is going to be an issue for sure. Iran's going to want money up front because of goodwill. And we're going to say, no, we want to see what your behavior is like. And we're going to meter the money to you. I suspect those are the issues that we're dealing with in trying to get an agreement on this draft document.
Yeah, a couple of things. We could just dissolve in the deal point.
All right. So that's it for General Keane. Now, on the issue of the blockade, he brings up the blockade near the beginning there as one of the main leverage points we have. The blockade is being tested. The Iranians have been testing the blockade. They tested it again yesterday. You see here, U.S. says it struck ship trying to breach blockade and reach Iran. The U.S. military stopped a merchant vessel trying to break through its blockade of Iranian ports by firing a missile into its engine room, the U.S. Central Command said on Saturday. The Gambia-flagged cargo ship Leon Star ignored more than 20 warnings from U.S. forces overnight as it tried to enter an Iranian port, the military said. The ship remained adrift in the Gulf of Oman, and U.S. forces have not boarded it, said a U.S. official with knowledge of the situation, speaking on condition of anonymity. With the latest action, the U.S. military has stopped 6 ships trying to breach the blockade. One was allowed to proceed. Another 116 ships have been redirected, the military said. And it talks about when the blockade was launched, but I want to show you one interesting little piece at the bottom here. Iran has even charged tolls for transit as high as $2 million, which experts have called a violation of a principle of international maritime trade, freedom of peaceful navigation. Qatar's deputy prime minister, Sheikh Saud bin Abdulrahman bin Hassan bin Ali Al Thani, said on Saturday that the Gulf nation opposes charging fees to transit, quote, but for certain times when they say they're going to use it for mine clearing or some usage of the fees for a temporary time, this is something that is negotiable and could be something that will help the transit of the Strait of Hormuz to be back to a normal stage. There's the Qataris trying to figure out ways to get money to the Iranian regime to keep them afloat. That's what that is. Look at the Qataris, always looking for a workaround for the Iranians. Now, on the issue of the charging of tolls, this is a topic I wanted to get into just to clarify it so that we're knowledgeable about the topic. So there's this interesting piece in DW Media here. Suez-Panama canals charge for transit. Why can't Hormuz? Great question, right? Meaning there are fees that are paid to the Suez Canal and the Panama Canal when you pass through. There are international waterways where there are tolls. So what's the issue? So the issue is this. Under international maritime law, natural straits used by shipping are governed by a special set of rules designed to protect global trade and freedom of navigation. The United Nations Convention on the Law of the Seas gives vessels and aircraft from all nations the right of so-called transit passage through international straits that connect two parts of the high seas. To qualify for transit passage, a vessel must move through the strait without delay and without anchoring except in emergencies. Those transits must be allowed to happen without interference from the coastal state. The UNCLOS rules state coastal states can charge only limited service charges, including pilotage and towing. We'll see an example of that soon. Canals like the Suez and Panama are man-made waterways built, owned, and maintained by sovereign states at enormous cost. Egypt generates annual revenues of around $4 billion in fees for ships transiting the Suez Canal. The 1888 Constantinople Convention, signed by major powers at the time, explicitly allows the Egyptian government to levy tolls to cover maintenance, operations, and upgrades. Meanwhile, the Panama Canal Authority, which runs the U.S.-built canal on behalf of Panama, is also permitted to charge fees under separate treaties. Completed in 1914 to link the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans, the Panama Canal requires huge ongoing maintenance, including constant dredging to combat sedimentation and landslides. Both canal operators typically charge less than half the fees that Iran is reportedly charging. So the principle is this in international waters, that if there's a man-made canal passing through someone's sovereign territory, then that's theirs, and it's a service that they're providing to the world, and it requires a lot of maintenance, and it's their own sovereign territory, and it's man-made, and therefore it's not governed by the rules of international waters. Natural waterways that link the seas together, that's international waterways, and it is forbidden to charge tolls. There are exceptions. We'll get to that in a moment. But take a look at this chart here. Iran wants to charge up to $2 million on an average toll payable in cryptocurrency or Chinese yuan. Egypt in the Suez Canal, where they legitimately charge tolls, charges between $400,000 and $1 million. And because it's more for larger vessels and it's an infrastructure toll, as we explained. Panama Canal between $300,000 and $700,000. And then you have exceptions like Russia in the Northern Sea charges tolls, not always, but charges tolls $300,000 to $500,000, mainly icebreaker services, because you have some tricky areas up there where there's ice flows. So they charge icebreaker services up there, pilotage and service tariffs in the Northern Sea route. But that just goes, I just wanted to touch on that to outline what the legalities are here. So when the United States says this is an international waterway, you can't charge tolls, there can't be any tolls, and Iran says, no, it's ours, we can charge whatever we want, it's our territorial waters, Just understand that this is the international law and this is how it works. Look, the bottom line of all of this is that the Iranians, going back to the first clip, we know who we're dealing with the Iranians. We know who we're dealing with. And we see on this news item I shared with you about this ship that was trying to pass through the blockade, that was stopped by the Americans and shelled by the Americans. It was on its way to an Iranian port, that they're trying to test the blockade. They're trying to get through. You see that the Americans are enforcing it. We've also seen those skirmishes that have taken place where the Americans have sent boats through. The Iranians have disrupted them. The Americans have then retaliated. So it's not a static situation going on there, but we see that the blockade is still in force. And hopefully what General Keane said is correct, that the negotiators on the American side know exactly who they're dealing with. They know the Iranians are never going to back down from their ambitions. And they're going to invest every cent that they can get a hold of in their mission. And we have to remember this. We have to be clear-eyed about this. When the dust settles on this war, if there's more of this Western-style thinking that, oh, they've suffered so much, or not suffered, we've damaged them so much, now let's give them a little bit of breathing room, they'll take the money and they'll lick their wounds and they'll rebuild themselves. We know who we're dealing with here. There's no reason to believe that they will do anything to make the lives of their people better beyond the bare minimum. And their goal remains death to America and death to Israel. We just have to be clear-eyed about who we're dealing with and pray for wisdom for President Trump and all the other decision makers involved here. And we'll keep you posted. God bless.